So hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, A Fresh Approach to Long-Term Data Compliance. And I'm Teresa Resick, and I am Vice President of Market Intelligence here at AIIM, and AIIM is your host and producer of this webinar. And OpenText is the underwriter of today's event, and we thank them very much for their support. And thank you for taking the time to join us today. As we get started, I just want to offer with a few pointers so that you can participate and join us in our webinar. So look to the chat feature and encourage you to open that up right now. Let us know where you are listening from today. I always like to know where in the world our audience is located. But it's also in this chat feature that we will share some links to some resources. And I encourage you to click on that link for the resource and open in a browser tab, and you can get a lot of really good additional reading in there. Some good case studies are in there. So please check out all of those resources. Do ask questions of our presenters as we go along today. Use either that chat feature or Q&A. And we have a block of time reserved towards the end of the webcast to go through all of those questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So do ask your questions as you think of them. Towards the end of the webcast, I would greatly appreciate it if you would take a brief feedback survey. Let us know how we're doing today. You can also suggest other topics for us to cover in future webinars. And look for the link for that feedback survey. Again, we will put that in the chat for you, and we'll remind you of that later on. I read every one of those responses, always value what you have to say. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted to the AIIM.org's Resources Learning Center page in just a few days. Now to introduce our host for today's webinar, Kevin Crane. And you may be very familiar with Kevin. I have the pleasure of working with him on a number of projects here. But Kevin is AIIM's content strategist, and he is the author of many of AIIM's ebooks and infographics on a wide variety of intelligent information and digital transformation topics. He is the producer and host of AIIM On Air podcast, and that podcast was recently listed on Forrester's 100 Best Channel Podcasts of 2021. So I encourage you to certainly check out AIIM.air or AIIM On Air to check out Kevin's podcast series. But right now, I'm going to turn things over to Kevin to continue on with our webinar today.
Hello, everybody. Hi, Teresa. Thanks a lot. It's great to be here today for another great AIIM webinar, this time with our friends from OpenText about the pivotal role of governing your information long-term. So it's no secret that organizations must save and archive a great deal of information these days. But according to our research, 42% of AIIM member organizations feel that information volume and the variety are expanding too quickly to keep up. And when you add to that the requirements for long-term archiving, for things like business continuity, and to meet our governance and legal hold requirements, well, you've got an ever-expanding tsunami of information to manage. So in this session, we are going to explore some of those challenges in managing today's infrastructure and take a look at some best practices for long-term archiving. I'm curious to know what information must be kept long-term and what doesn't need to be kept, how we can meet our critical compliance requirements while at the same time working to simplify the infrastructure and the effort required, and what strategies and policies are really the best practices for governing information long-term. As records managers and information management professionals, it's really important to understand the implications of having access to longer-term records and ensure that the infrastructure supports our ongoing retention and compliance policies and practices. So with that, I'd like to welcome our guest speaker today, Mike Safar. Mike is a product marketing manager or product marketing director, excuse me, for information governance at OpenText. He's experienced in all aspects of leading software product strategy with a focus on information governance, content analytics, e-discovery, and more. So welcome, Mike. Are you with us?
Yep. Hi, Kevin.
Hello, Mike. Welcome aboard. Now, organizations often have information scattered across maybe dozens of applications and certainly many different silos on their network or within their enterprise. Can you give us a better sense of the implications of this, especially when it comes to long-term archiving?
Sure. So, I want to go back to one thing you asked in your intro, which is what do we need to keep and what don't we need to keep? And this has gotten a lot more complex over the years. So we tend to think about records from, we may have a records policy that covers all the information we have, and it's not always clear how that fits in with the volume of data that's being kept and within each silo. So a lot of folks think about transitory data or transient data in terms of communications, and in some cases this is actually the shortest period of time that we have to keep that data. So for example, draft versions of documents or emails that I send to somebody, or even an email about a picnic or whatever, company picnic, that kind of data tends to be the shortest. It can be an incredibly large volume of the data that we have, but we also have a more complex records policy that we have to deal with, and we have tended to keep pretty much in the, if you look back 10 years, 20 years, tried to keep everything we could afford to keep and just have these big buckets of information that we're trying to deal with. We can't do that anymore. The regulators are on to everybody. And so we really have to think about classifying that data and understanding where to put it. And that's just an incredible challenge. And we're going to talk a little bit about what those challenges are today. So, a lot of organizations think of archives and they're familiar with file archives and email archives, but actually there's data in many, many different silos within our organizations. So, I like to break it down this way. We tend to have, I break it into three classes of applications. Cloud applications here really just represents the newest applications, those applications that are active, that we are, there are our mainline applications that everybody's using every day. We may also have many on-premises applications, custom applications, or applications we just have not migrated to the cloud. And in those, we find that there are actually most of the information in there is going to be in a long-term records policy of some sort. So it may be that you can just think of email as just one of those. SAP has many different modules, and you can think of each one of those modules as separate. Oracle Financials is the same way, and each of your custom applications. And there are some differences in the cost of keeping that information in the cloud and in active application. But one of the most costly is those legacy systems, those systems that no longer are collecting new data, but we have to keep them around because of long-term compliance. In fact, IDC and the General Accounting Office have found that up to 80% of your spending may be on these legacy systems to, deal with the backups, deal with the hardware, to keep them running, the training for the IT staff to understand how to run it, power, everything that's involved in that. And yet here's data that you only maybe intermittently are keeping. And the only reason you're keeping it around this data that's in various applications, an old document management system, an old imaging system, maybe an old HR system of some sort, is because of long-term retention. And you don't know how to necessarily get that out and into a less expensive place to comply. And if we break that down, if we break down these legacy systems, we tend to see several different categories of these. Of course, mainframe applications are among the most expensive, and it's incredible because it's the most expensive, and yet it's probably some of the most important data to keep around. Otherwise, you would have moved on to something else if you could easily move those applications. If we look at the cost of keeping this data long term, we have not just the storage and the backup, but we also have to think about the fact that the regulations are changing. Okay. We've got privacy and protection issues. We've got security issues that we need to deal with. And we have user access issues as well. So we may have terminal access that we have to grant to these various applications. And this all is just really expensive. And it's even expensive to the end users who have to access it. They don't want to go into these old applications on a regular basis. But if you look at just what the retention changes, the data sovereignty issues, we'll talk about this in a little bit more later, and those privacy issues that are caused by these legacy systems, data leak, risk, and so forth. We actually have a mandate to move away from those legacy systems and into something that can deal with the compliance in a much, much better way. If we look at, as I stated earlier, if we look at active applications, 60% of this data may actually be business complete information that we are paying a lot of money for in terms of the volume that we have to pay a contract price for the volume we're keeping. We have to pay for the storage, the backup, all of that to keep data around for sometimes 15, 20, 30 years. When you run these numbers out, you find out that some organizations are just not willing to do that. One of our customers, BMO Harris Bank, had 16 different applications, and over those 16 applications, they were paying over $250,000 per month to retain that data. And by coming up with an archiving scenario, they believe that they are saving over $10 million by consolidating that information and giving themselves the freedom to actually just keep their active data in these various systems. We also have some issues around upgrading these applications. So whereas in the cloud, we tend to have cloud that is updated, the applications are updated regularly. That is not necessarily the case with these active applications. They're expensive to upgrade, and they're expensive to migrate to the cloud. And finally, with cloud applications, this is actually a driver. So a lot of people want to upgrade to the cloud, but they don't want to put all of their data necessarily in these expensive cloud applications. They may want a cheaper place to put it. So, I'm going to talk about these in further detail, Kevin, but that's really an intro to what we're talking about today. And we'll break it down further.
Well, as you're talking, Mike, I'm wondering, I am wondering what we do instead. I mean, these legacy systems, as you mentioned, have been around for a while. We may be perhaps familiar with some of the constraints and issues, but what do I do to improve my practices today in 2022?
Sure. So, one of the things I want to, talk about is this notion of having a monolithic view of archiving. So you're going to have all these different applications. Let's think about it. And you want to come up with a grand unification plan that's going to allow you to retain this data for decades to come. And so the idea is, oh, we have an archive. So we have a file archive. I'm going to try to jam everything into that file archive. I'm going to try to figure out a way to manage all of my information from that perspective. And that one size fits all approach really does not work very well. So, if we look at typical metadata that we're going to keep, the metadata, we have some standard metadata that you will find on just about any type of record. What is your record's policy? What is the date that is going to trigger our retention period? Typically, we may just have a keep it for so many years, or we may have it keep it from a particular customer event, and we have to manage that metadata over time. So if we try to have just one place where we keep all of our metadata across all of these different record types, whether they be contracts, legal notices, audits, structured data from various applications, we keep having to add fields to it. We have this unwieldy search, and we have search results that are coming back to users that don't make any sense. So one of the things that we want to be able to do is to have archiving of record types that makes sense for that particular type of record, but still have the centralized control. We also have different formats that we have to deal with. So for example, we obviously we have documents and email, but we may have structured data that's in a database or that comes directly out of an application, or we may have print streams. So, and we have insurance companies that have insurance statements that have to be archived, and it comes out in a long stream. So there might be 1 million documents in one day's output. So how do we archive that and sensibly deal with that kind of output and not have to pay too much money for it?
How do we do that? What are your recommendations to improve our results?
Well, so we have to think about I'll show you on this slide, and I'll talk about the print stream as well. With the relational data, the old way of dealing with this was to output it to a report, okay? And the problem with the reports is often those reports didn't include all the data, and we weren't actually complying with the records policy. So now with structured data, what we have to think about is preserving the entirety of the record and all of its relationships within the database. It's very complex data. It may seem simple to the end user if they've got a screen and it's got a few fields on it, but actually there's a lot of data behind it, and it's all scattered among various tables. So we have to package up all that into a high fidelity representation of that data that's labeled and lay it down into storage so that we could reconstitute it, so that we can view it in context. We'll talk about user accessibility as well. Now, when we talk about print stream data, well, we could break that data up into individual PDFs, but you know what's going to happen is your storage is going to blow out. You're just going to be storing enormous amounts of data. So there are methods with archiving that are fairly complex, but essentially what we can do is take that print stream output directly out of the mainframe and split it up among various records and be able to present a PDF only when you retrieve it. So we basically have compressed print stream data. We can even dispose of that on a particular schedule, but the way we're storing it is in that compressed format, and it's not blowing it out with all these individual PDF documents. It's very, very specific to that type of data, just like the relational data is specific to that type. Very different formats, very different use cases.
Mike, archives universally have basic records policies and hold capabilities, but still there are a number of further compliance difficulties that organizations are facing. For those of us that are designing our strategies and approaches today, what are some of the other regulatory and compliance issues that we must consider?
Okay, so there's really three different things that I want to talk about today. The complexity of the retention rules has gotten very interesting. So the typical approach to archiving was to wait until a particular event occurred, which would start the clock on the retention. And then everything in the archive was held for a certain period of time. As soon as it hits the archive, we're going to keep it for 10 years, 15 years, whatever that is. But we've got so much data that we actually may want to archive long before that. So it might be that the retention period, for example, is hold until 10 years past the patient death, okay, just to make something up. Well, when is that patient death? That patient death may be in 20 years. So now we have to track that data separately. We have to track the patient data death date, but we also have to have immutable storage to keep the actual record that we're going. That creates quite a burden. So we have much more complex rules that we can automate with. We want to be able to automate. There's just too much to do this manually. We want to be able to automate our disposition. And that means we need to have enough data that we're keeping that will allow us to automate and set automation rules so that we can do this in bulk. We can dispose of 10 million records, we can place content on holds, so forth. It has not been until very recently that we've seen users understand this, that they need to be able to archive long before these events happen, and therefore have very complex rules involved. Another issue is privacy. Okay, so we used to just archive everything, and if you put that data in immutable storage, you may actually be placing yourself out of compliance with these new privacy rules. Okay, so there's a lot on this slide. I won't go through all of it out of respect for the time, but I think one key thing is to really think, do I need to archive this data, or is there a privacy rule that would actually let me keep the business data that I need, but get rid of some of these identifiers that create data leaks? Or another option might be to split that data into pieces, to have two streams of data, so that I have privacy information that I may have to destroy and my business continuity information in a separate archive, but still allow the user to see it combined onto one screen, okay, or to see pieces of it. So what we do, we can allow you to split that data up, or we can actually redact it as it goes in. Just put X's in the social security number before it goes in. There are even more complicated issues around that, but there's a lot of data prep that can be done, and you want a set of tools that will allow you to do that data prep. And in some cases, right in the documents themselves, go into the PDF and look that up and redact it in the PDF itself. And then another issue is data sovereignty. Okay, so what data sovereignty is about is that there are emerging over the last several years rules that require that the data about a customer or about a particular type of record stay in the jurisdiction for which that data was created. So it cannot leave the country, or it cannot be retained outside of the country. So if you're a big multinational corporation or organization, all of a sudden now you have to create all these different archives. Now you've created a management headache for yourself. You have all of these different archives, and yet now I have to create policies and processes in each one of these. What you'd rather be able to do is to think about it as one channel, one infrastructure type that the data is going into, and one place where I can manage my compliance, but still be able to lay down the data in the jurisdiction that the records retention requires it to be in. And in a lot of cases, people just weren't complying with these data sovereignty requirements. Now it's becoming much, much more important. In fact, geopolitical issues like what we're going through right now may actually make this even more important for some organizations. We have an energy company that is dealing with this right now with quite a large volume of information that has to be placed in some very interesting jurisdictions as a result. So Kevin?
Mike, tell me more about data accessibility for long-term archives. You mentioned having patient data for a period after their death. That could be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, who knows? So what do organizations need to be thinking about and strategizing for today related to this access of long-term archives versus short-term archives, access to that for their processes, or whether it needs to be offloaded? How do we deal with all of that?
Yeah. So one of the blockers for people putting information in an archive is that they need to make sure that the users who need it have access to it. And we may also not feel like we can archive it because even our customers need access to it. So we have a customer, Agility, for example, that continues to need access to the data for 15, 25 years for their particular customers to access it. And we have energy companies that actually need consumers to access it. So if the way that you access that is through the original application only, and the archive has no conduit to those customers, you've got a real problem. You may also need it for data analytics. So we need many different modes of access. Of course, we want, the basic archive, search for a record, find it, display that record, and we want to display it in context to see, master detail view, see the invoice and the items on that invoice, just as a simple example. We may want to see a printout that came from a mainframe, but we need to be able to see it in PDF format. So these are retrieval capabilities, but we may also want to view that within the context of another application. So instead of making the user go to the archive, let's bring the archive to the user. So if I'm in a CRM application and I'm on a customer support call, I want to look at history, there should be a button right on that customer support text screen that says customer history. You click it, that's going to give you relevant records from the archive. Now they're not thinking about it as an archive. They're just thinking about it as old data about that user, maybe, you know, anything 5 years and older, that sort of thing. And of course, we want API access to build this data into mobile apps for consumer access or data mining apps, these sorts of methodologies. So, you know, the basic search, the ability to contextually access that data and convert it to a user-friendly format, and the ability to access it via API and use it in some other form that the archive doesn't do naturally. So
Mike, how does OpenText help with all of this? Can you give us some next steps and maybe talk a little bit about OpenText's approach to information archiving in general?
sure. So thank you, Kevin. You know, we have approached this by, you know, historically, we have a number of different archiving methods, but we've tried to really simplify that and boil it down into really just a couple of ways to think about accessing the data. And the most versatile way that we think about that is through our product InfoArchive. And InfoArchive is a general purpose archiving product that deals with, of course, it deals with documents and unstructured information, but it also deals with structured data and print streams in a really robust way. So we have thought about each one of the issues that I've talked about being able to have the best possible archive and the highest fidelity representation of the data for long-term retention for structured data and unstructured data, and also for print streams, customer communications, and to place that into one cloud-based infrastructure. And so what we tend to see is that you know, our customers will start with legacy systems, data, and applications that's no longer used, and then expand that out to active systems, and they wind up with a view where all of their business complete information is then in InfoArchive, and these legacy systems are not a cost anymore whatsoever. And so then we only have about 20 to 40% of their information in their active applications, and that makes the cost of digital transformation and moving to newer applications, modernizing, a lot more palatable, because InfoArchive is handling this long-term retention, compliance, privacy, security of most of the data in your organization. We attach to that some user accessibility capabilities that are quite interesting. So we have a way of modeling the data on screen so that they can see something that is familiar to the user. The user was looking at on screen or paper reports. We can model those reports on screen so that they see the data as it was. And that's why it's important to have a high fidelity version of that content and not just dumb CSV files, for example. And we can integrate with a multi-purpose viewer so that you can see content in any format, maybe even a CAD format, for example. So we have customers who have data PDFs, documents, and they also have CAD documents they want to archive. We can actually view that and let you operate with that type of very complex data. And one other thing I want to mention here is that the InfoArchive, we have poured a lot of R&D into making this product a deployable in many, many different scenarios. So the great majority of our customers come to us and they're not quite ready to go to the cloud, but the cloud migration is accelerating very, very quickly. And so what we've been doing is we have built a architecture that we can deploy on premises and we can deploy in the customer's own cloud. That's a very popular option. And in fact, we're partnering with Amazon, for example, who Amazon Web Services will be able to provide this to their customers through the marketplace for data center migration. And of course, we also have our own SaaS, the OpenText Cloud, where we can manage it for you. So we have a very, very broad set of deployment options and we've worked very hard to make it low maintenance, because if the archive is high maintenance, we have no point in archiving that data. We have to keep that cost as low as we can. We even have a hybrid version where you keep the archive on site, but you can use, for example, Amazon S3 or Google cold storage to take advantage of the advantages of cloud storage without, and that's one of the ways in which you can deal with the data sovereignty, for example. So that's a real quick overview of InfoArchive. As I said, it's our general purpose product, and we have other ways of archiving archiving content as well. So, for example, with our SAP customers, we can actually embed our archiving inside of the SAP infrastructure. And that gives you all of these capabilities, but with even higher fidelity, user retrieval, and convenience.
We are speaking with Mike Safar, Product Marketing Director for Information Governance at OpenText. And at this point, we would like to open it up for any questions from the folks that are attending today. What are your questions for Mike? Let's take advantage of his expertise while we have him here. I know that we do have a couple of questions coming in, Mike. One from Suzanne. Do you currently have any school districts that use this application, and what types of records are stored for these entities?
Off the top of my head, I don't know. I can't name a school district. I do know that we have some education customers, but typically what we would see in an organization like that is, for example, student records from an old student management system or HR type records, because school districts just have really a strong need to comply, of course, with the government. But there's so many different types of records. But one of the most expensive things that a district has to manage with their limited budget is these student systems. And, how long are they going to keep that data? HR records, anything that's on legal hold, that type of data. So InfoArchive in particular is such a horizontal product that you see commonalities between many different organizations. So our healthcare is dealing with healthcare customers are dealing with patient data, and HR is a very common place to start with archiving, because you've got turnover and the clock starts on this data, but it's really of no use except for that retention. So they'll start with a simple project like HR and then move on to other applications that they need to archive. And in fact, the best way to justify the cost of this is to, get a project under your belt, improve the platform, get the platform down. But once you get that fixed cost of dealing with the platform, adding other applications is less and less expensive for you. So you're actually getting a much better amortization on your implementation of an archive by adding as many applications as you can. As I said, BMO Harris saved $10 million over 16 different applications. That's a very common story for our customer base.
Earlier, you mentioned a strategy in which someone may want to splice out their personal information from other information so that sensitive information can be disposed, but business context still exists. Can you give an example of content you may handle in that manner that would produce a relevant product?
Right. So you may want to keep data, try to, create a real simple example. Sensitive data like name, address, phone number, email, their credit history, things like this are subject to privacy regulations, but they are attached to other business continuity information. So for the long-term compliance, I may not need to contact that particular customer at that phone number in the future. But if the customer says, I want to destroy that data, you don't want to have to destroy necessarily everything you need for business continuity. You're not required to do that. If you try to keep this privacy information around, you're creating a data leak risk and being out of compliance. And so what you can do is you can either decide not to archive that data and just document that you once had it. And part of your policy is we're not going to archive that. So you can actually redact it out, just put X's in it. In some cases with like credit card information, you don't want to do that because you can cause some issues with integration with other systems. So you can create fake, basically masked credit card numbers to place in the system and mark that it is a masked number. But create two streams of data, one stream for the sensitive information and one stream for your own business data that you're going to keep. And that way, if you have a request to delete, you can remove that. And the other thing you can do is just not make it available. So you can keep that data because of data retention needs, but you don't make it available on screen to your own users when they're in this customer service app. They don't have access to any of that sensitive data. They just have the notes from the customer support calls. Okay. Is a way to approach it.
Thank you, Crystal, for that question. And we have another one, Mike, from Julie. How do documents get ingested into the archive tool? Is there any IT systems that you can migrate directly from into the archive tool, or do you generally migrate it from an IT system and then upload it to your archive system as two separate activities? What do you?
Well, every source is different. Of course, we have out-of-the-box connectors for all of our repositories. For example, Documentum, we have a very productized way to grab data out of Documentum. And of course, we can grab from SharePoint and from file systems. But in other cases, particularly those that are relational database structured data, that data has to be thought about very carefully. So that's almost always dealt with a services contract where we will map the data and come up with a conduit in place. Now, we do have tools for doing that. And of course, we've done it for many, many different applications. Some of our partners have done it with, for example, healthcare systems like Epic, for example, and they have the expertise in those particular systems. But even if it's a custom application, we have a standard format that we accept the information in. It's called SIP. And, we use an open format for machine readable format so that we're not storing it in a proprietary format, but you've got to have some way to translate that information into this open format from its original. What we want to do is have it be address all of these different issues of privacy, having the right metadata on it so that you can search on it, retrieve it correctly, so that you can drive the retention on it. And this requires some analysis up front for each one of these repositories. But as I said, each time you go to a new application, it gets cheaper and cheaper to do that.
All right, we are with Mike Safar from OpenText. Please keep sending in your questions. If we don't get to them all here on our session today, we will be passing them on to Mike, and you'll have an opportunity to collaborate directly with him on any further questions that you have. We are getting a bit short on time, Mike, but I do want to get to one from Leanne. When you embed archiving in SAP, in an SAP structure, is the purge delete process different than it is in the info archive system?
It is a different mechanism, but it's essentially the same concept. So in SAP, we have a product core archive for SAP. So we have a lot of customers with Info Archive that are archiving SAP data. And that tends to be data that is, absolutely business complete, and they're not going to touch it again. But we have kind of an active archiving product that's more embedded so that more recent data is available to the SAP users. And there's a different mechanism, but it has all of the same controls, event-based retention, legal holds that is available to it. And it's quite a bit more sophisticated in that than, for example, what you might get from SAP natively. In fact, SAP carries our products.
That is Mike Safar. Find him and find out more at opentext.com. Mike, I want to thank you for being part of our event today, and turn it back over to Teresa to help us close it out. Teresa, are you there?
Yes, I am. And I'm just going to say, Mike, don't go away, because I'm going to have another question for you. I have really been enjoying this discussion. Thank you, Mike and OpenText. I really have been enjoying this. But I do want to just take a brief moment and just mention a couple of things that we are doing here at AIM, and just wanted to let you know about AIM Plus, and want to encourage you to investigate that, check it out, join it. It's our thriving community of our online community. And in with that, we also offer a variety of different training sessions, regularly scheduled member only, ask me anything sessions. There's a whole lot of communication and learning opportunities in with AIM Plus, and I encourage you to check it out. So if you go to aim.org/aim-plus, you can learn more about what those opportunities are. We offer a monthly subscription, or you can join on an annual basis, and there's 2 different tiers. So just a way to customize how to help you learn more about the wide variety of information management topics that we have here to share with you at AIM. And then the other really cool thing that I am very much excited about, we are finally getting back together in person for a conference. I am so excited. We are going to be in Denver the last week of April 27th to the 29th. Go to aimconference.com. We're already posting the detailed agenda of the sessions are up there. As keynotes get confirmed, as speakers get confirmed, all of that information is being added. And I know that there's already a number of sessions that are being confirmed in here. Our events team headed up by Georgina Clellan has put together a fantastic conference session. And it's just, we are all ready to be, I know here at AIIM, we are all ready to be back and talking and meeting with you all in person and helping you learn more and how to make the business case within your organization for all of these different things that we need to keep our businesses running. So I encourage you again to go back to aimconference.com and learn more about what we have in store in Denver for you. And as Kevin mentioned, we are getting it to the end of our webinar hour today. Very much want to thank OpenText for their contributions as the underwriter of our event. Without the support from our solution providers, AIIM wouldn't be able to bring you our free educational content like these webinars. So thank you, OpenText, for your sponsorship support. And certainly thanks to Mike Safar at OpenText. But just as also we've been recording this webinar, we will get that posted back to our website so you can catch anything that you might have missed and invite your colleagues to come and listen to this. In the chat feature, Jess is going to drop in there one more time, links to those resources. Please complete the feedback survey. Let us know what you think. I always love hearing about all of this, but certainly I just want to close things out by I'm going to start first with Mike Safar from OpenText. What is your closing thought or a key takeaway from all the fabulous things that you've been sharing with us today? Mike?
Well, I think it can be very overwhelming to imagine archiving so much data in your organization, but I want to encourage you to try to think about the opportunity that you have for spending your money in other places other than managing all these legacy applications. And to see us at the AIIM conference, we'll be there, of course, and we'd love to talk to you more about this and all of our content management products.
Thank you, Mike. And Kevin Crane from AIIM. I just want to give you the opportunity to offer your thoughts and a summation of everything that we've been discussing.
Well, when we think about information management, we often think about the process, the immediate process of running the business every day, sort of the short term, maybe sort of mindset when it comes to information access. But as records managers and information management professionals, it's important to understand the implications of long-term access and long-term retention as well, having access to those longer-term records while ensuring that the infrastructure supports our ongoing retention and compliance and policies and practices, and thoughtful access and automation of that access to longer-term records. So this has really been a great session to explore some of that, and certainly one that I think will provide value to those of us that are designing our strategies today.
Well, that does bring our webinar to a close today. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time for joining us. Thank you to OpenText, and with everybody here at AIIM, have a great afternoon. We'll see you at our next event.
Bye, everybody.